Chapter 8 Part 1. Topics in this chapter: Constitutional Convention of 1867. Resists the enlargement of the canals. Resents the imputation of having sympathized with the rebellion. Combats the Tweed ring. Joins in organizing the New York Bar Association. Measures for the reform of the judiciary. Elected to the Legislature in 1871. Advice of Horatio Seymour. Advises impeachment of corrupt judges. Mr. Tilden was elected from the 7th Senatorial District of New York City as a delegate to the convention called to revise the Constitution of the state in 1867. His colleagues from that district were Judge Anthony L. Robinson, Edwards Pierrepont, and James Brooks. He was a member of the Committee on the Finances of the State, the Public Debt, Revenues, Expenditures, and Taxation, and Restriction of the Powers of the Legislature in respect thereto. He was a member of the committee instructed to report the best practical mode of proceeding to revise the Constitution, and was also a member of a select committee on suppressing official corruption by means of constitutional provisions. The most conspicuous feature of his service in that body was his successful resistance to a scheme for the enlargement of the Erie Canal. His speech on that subject was probably the most important deliverance in that convention, as he was unquestionably the highest authority on the subject of canal transportation in that body. To the surprise of most if not all of his colleagues in the convention, he demonstrated the folly of incurring an expense of $20 or $30 millions to enlarge the prism of the canal, by showing that the canal as it was, if properly cleaned and worked, would suffice for double the business that was ever likely to be required of it. It is, said he, an enlargement of the capacity of the men who administer the canal which is now wanted, and not an enlargement of the canal. He added, I will undertake to say that if you will appoint, in full charge of the Erie Canal, men who can be picked out in this state, and let them manage it upon these principles, practically, they will get a greater reduction of the cost of transportation by the expenditure of $1 million than my friend the gentleman from Merrick Mr. Hatch will get by his gunboat enlargement if it is carried into effect, at a cost starting with $8 millions and culminating in $20 or $30 millions. These words imported far more than his audience then surmised. No one should attempt to deal officially or unofficially with the management of the canal system of New York without thoroughly mastering the contents of this speech. The Republicans were in a large majority in the convention, and the antagonisms of the late war unhappily found too frequent expression in the deliberations, with the result, probably not to be regretted, of the rejection by the people of the Constitution which the convention adopted. The extension of Negro suffrage became naturally enough one of the burning questions. Mr. Tilden wished that question submitted separately to the people, lest, in the prevailing temper of the public mind of that time, it should imperil the rest of their work. In the course of some remarks upon this subject he made the following statement. There recurs to me a singular incident illustrating the extent to which our constitutional regulations have been copied in other states. It happened to me in the convention of 1846 that an article on corporations had been bellowed to and fro without coming to a result satisfactory to anybody, and it was sent to a select committee of which I was chairman. That committee decided on the adoption of one provision that I was unable at that time to understand. I reported it as they ordered, and it became a part of the fundamental law. A short time after that I was passing through Albany, and I heard a very curious discussion in the Senate as to the meaning of that provision. On my returning to New York I met the author of it, and I found him as much puzzled as the Senate had been or as I had been. But, sir, that article, clause for clause, word for word, and letter for letter, stands in the Constitution of 7 different states of the Union. It illustrates to what extent our example is likely to be followed in other states. I consider, therefore, that we have a most august and important duty to perform, and for my part, unmoved by any consideration except my desire to fulfill that trust to the utmost of my ability, rising, as I think it does, above all other considerations that could affect the action of men in this body, and remembering that I shall scarcely live under another constitution of the state, and that all those associations and that honorable pride that have clustered around my native state from my childhood are concerned in the result of our work, I certainly desire to do everything in my power to accomplish that result in the most satisfactory manner. I am not here to question any man's motives or to arraign any man's judgment, but I regret profoundly that this convention has not found itself able, by a little conference among the leading gentlemen who represent the two great parties here, to have come to a result that would have withdrawn this topic from our deliberations. I think it could have been done. I think it is unfortunate that we have not done it. I certainly would be quite content to have a reasonable postponement of this question, provided that postponement did not involve a decision before and of the question postponed. But, sir, to be called upon to put the clause in controversy into the Constitution, to make it a part of an entire instrument, to vote on its adoption, so that if there be no other action of this body, and no other action is necessary, the question is wholly and completely decided, does not seem to me to be the best way to reserve the question of separate submission. If we are finally to act upon the whole matter, I shall desire hereafter to submit the reasons which govern my vote on the main question. In reply to a grossly partisan speech or series of speeches of Waldo Hutchins, of New York, to which some allusions to national politics contributed their bitterness, Mr. Tilden took occasion to denounce the imputation implied, if not expressed, that he, in common with those who acted with him on the Finance Committee, sympathized with the rebellion. Mr. Tilden said, "One other topic deserves a passing notice, and then I have done. The honorable member from the state at large, residing in New York Clafter, has thought it fit, thought it becoming, thought it decent, to describe members of the Finance Committee, if I understand him correctly, as sympathizing with the rebellion. So, I desire to know of that honorable gentleman, as I am myself a member of that committee, whether he applies any such language to me." A member. He is gone. Mr. Tilden. So, I am sorry that the honorable member is not here to answer. I pass then from this aspersion, simply saying of it that, so far as he may have intended to apply it, either individually or generally, so that I come within the scope of its application, it is an entire falsehood and calumny, in all its degrees and in all its parts. Sir, at the beginning of the rebellion, called on by distinguished men to take some part in the public measures in the city of New York relating to that subject, I answered that I would give to the public agents, although elected by the opposite party, although I was unable to influence their policy, a support as full, as fair, as candid, and as liberal as I would have given to Andrew Jackson if he had been in the presidential chair in place of Mr. Lincoln. And during the entire war I never deviated from that position. I did often disagree widely with the policy which characterized the administration during the war, sometimes on military questions, sometimes in regard to civil affairs and the objects which the war should be prosecuted to attain, and generally on the subject of finance. On that subject I agree with my distinguished friend from New York, Mr. Opdyke. I agree, I believe, with every well-educated political economist in the country. We all thought that it was unnecessary and unwise to introduce, to the extent to which it was introduced, this paper money system, which is to be the curse of this and perhaps of generations that will come after us. I do not mean to say, Mr. Chairman, that this system, with all its evils, was not and is not an infinitely less evil than it would have been to have submitted to the dismemberment of our country. I have no doubt upon that subject. I have no doubt that every other object except civil liberty, under constitutional government, was inferior to the object of maintaining the unity, the power, and the renown of this great country. But so, on the subject of finance, I was of the opinion, with such men as Mr. Gallatin, as well as my friend Mr. Opdyke, that the system adopted was not a necessary, or a wise, or a proper one. When it was adopted, however, by those who had and have the lead in the affairs of the country and the control of the government against my counsels. Like a good citizen, I endeavored to make the best of it, and even abstained from urging objections to it in public discussions when it was apparent that it would be adopted, and that an exposition of its true character would only tend to hasten the catastrophe which was inherent in the nature of the system, and to the fatal brink of which, as the Secretary of the Treasury afterward avowed, we nearly approached. So, I know that it is quite common among small and narrow partisans to make such expressions as the member has thought fit to indulge in with reference to the Democratic Party. In regard to almost that entire party, with a few exceptions, eccentricities which happen in all large parties, I believe it to be as utter and complete a calumny as it is in its application to myself. What is to be gained at this day by the revival of these stale and exploded political falsehoods? At what end do they aim? What good purpose do they serve? The honorable gentleman from Rensselaer, Mr. M. Townsend, to whom I have already alluded, might have added to the grounds upon which he commended the democracy, so far as represented upon this floor, that hitherto they have on frequent occasions forborne to repel aspersions of this character, as false and as calumnious as that to which I am now replying, that they have submitted to them without making any reply, in the hope that this body might not degenerate into a partisan club, and leave its deliberations for the discussion of party politics or the renewal of party controversies, to be revived not with advantage to or in honor of anybody here, and entirely inconsistent with and unworthy of the grand and important public objects for which this body is convened. I hope, therefore, sir, that none of us will have hereafter any further occasion during our session to discuss or refer to such subjects. I have, however, deemed what I have said today to be indispensably called for by the insolent tone assumed by the gentleman in respect to us, who will not consent to be here or to participate in the discussions of this body except as equals and as gentlemen entitled to gentlemanly treatment from all other gentlemen upon this floor. Mr. Tilden had scarcely finished his labors in the Constitutional Convention when he was precipitated into a struggle upon which he had more at stake than upon any other crisis of his life. In the year 1857 the legislature of the state of New York was beguiled into imposing upon the city of New York a charter which provided that but 6 persons should be voted for as supervisors by each elector and 12 chosen. In other words, that the nominees of both the Republican and Democratic Party caucuses should be elected. At the succeeding session of the legislature their terms of office were extended from 4 to 6 years. This gave a board of supervisors consisting of 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats, to change a majority of which it was necessary to have the control of the primary meetings of both of the great national and state parties for 4 years in succession, a series of coincidences which rarely happens in a generation. The individual man has little enough chance of converting a minority into a majority when allowed a choice between 2 opposing parties. This scheme deprived him of that little chance and left the public entirely at the mercy of the managers of the primaries, by withdrawing from the latter all local restraints. The result of such a political solipsism responded promptly to the intention of those who devised it, in a combination between these 12 supervisors and the members of easy virtue in the legislature, which rapidly developed into the most powerful, reckless, and rapacious organization of which American politics had had any experience. It embraced just enough influential men in the organization of each party to control the action of both. Men who in public pushed to extremes the abstract ideas of their respective parties, while secretly they joined hands in common schemes for personal power and profit. It soon acquired the control of all legislation affecting the city, multiplied offices to be filled by its dependents, took possession of the city judiciary, and in time managed to hold the balance of power in the conventions and other political organizations of both parties. Intoxicated by their success and encouraged by the patience with which the people had submitted to their depredations, They induced the legislature in 1870 to so enlarge their power as practically to place the power and wealth of the city at the mercy of a man who had been a contractor under the city government, and had gradually risen to be the corypheus of this combination. His name was William M. Tweed, and the combination referred to has gone into history by the name of the Tweed ring. It has been publicly stated by Mr. Tilden, and the statement has never been discredited, that $1 million stolen from the taxpayers of New York were taken to Albany to secure the passage of this charter, and a prominent judge of the Supreme Court, a Republican in politics, has been given as authority for the statement that 6 of the leading senators of his own party received $10,000 each for voting for this charter, and $10,000 more for their votes in favor of other bills in the same interest during that and the following year. By this charter, the city government was confided to several commissioners who were respectively heads of departments, each entirely independent of the other, could only be removed by impeachment, and were accountable to no one. It also provided that all claims should be audited by 3 persons: the Commissioner of Public Works, the Mayor, and the Comptroller. In 1866, Mr. Tilden had been chosen chairman of the State Committee to succeed Dean Richmond. He has thus stated his motives for accepting this position, which he had accepted with great reluctance, and only after having tried in vain to place it in hands in which he could have confidence. I desired to save from degradation the great party whose principles and traditions were mine by inheritance and conviction, and to make it an instrument of a reaction in the community which could alone save free government. Holding wearily the end of a rope, because I feared where it might go if I dropped it, I kept the state organization in absolute independence. I never took a favor of any sort from these men, or from any man I distrusted. I had not much power in the legislature on questions which interested private cupidity, but in a state convention, where the best men in society and business would go, because it was for but a day or two, those with whom I acted generally had the majority. Knowing Mr. Tilden's distrust of them and his influence in the state, the Tweed ring, as it is now historically known, attempted to have him deposed by the State Convention of 1869 from the chairmanship of the State Committee, that they might secure the control of the Democratic state organization. Mr. Tilden accepted battle, and defeated them by the adverse vote of 7/8 of the convention. Before the passage of this Tweed charter, Tweed was Deputy Street Commissioner. When it became vacant, he wished the chairmanship for himself. It was given to another. The new charter vacated the offices of Street Commissioner and of all functionaries of the Croton Department, vested their powers in a Commissioner of Public Works, and conferred upon the Mayor, then at Oakey Hall, the power to appoint that Commissioner. The act was passed on the 5th of April, and on the 9th Mr. Tweed was appointed Commissioner of Public Works for 4 years. The power of the governor to remove him on charges was repealed, and all powers of removal were taken from the city government. Impeachment was only possible if the mayor preferred charges, and the trial of the impeachment was only possible in case every one of the 6 judges of the Court of Common Pleas was present. In like manner, the offices of 3 of the 5 park commissioners were granted for 5 years to 3 of Tweed's conspirators, with control of every park in the city and of the boulevards. The office of Chamberlain, the departments of police, of health, the comptrollership, and the law department of the corporation were all usurped by the same combination, to whom the city of New York, with all its wealth and power, were delivered over in impotent subjection. Nor was any time lost in improving the opportunities for depredation which had been thus nefariously secured. Within a month after the passage of the Tweed Charter, the Board of Special Audit, which it created, were signing orders for the payment of over $6 million of money, of which it is now known that scarcely 10% in value was realized by the city. Tweed got 24%, and his tools, shares proportioned to their real or supposed value to him. Over $250,000 was sent to Albany to be distributed among the members of the legislature. The percentages of theft, comparatively moderate in 1869, reached 66%. In 1870 and later 85%. The aggregate of fraudulent bills audited after the passage of the Tweed Charter was about $12,250,000 in 1870 and $3,400,000 in 1871. In December of the year 1869, Mr. Tilden united with a few leading members of the New York Bar in a call for the meeting at which the Bar Association was formed. At that meeting, a few decisive and defiant words quickened into life an association which has proved an important ally in the cause of reform, and which but for his timely intervention would probably have shared the fate of dozens of similar unsuccessful efforts to organize and combine for public purposes the varied talents and interests of the Bar of New York. If the Bar, he said, is to become merely a mode of making money, making it in the most convenient way possible, but making it at all hazards, then the Bar is degraded. Tilden receives applause. If the Bar is to be merely an institution that seeks to win causes, and win them by backdoor access to the judiciary, then it is not only degraded, but it is corrupt. A great applause fills the room. The Bar, if it is to continue to exist, if it would restore itself to the dignity and honor which it once possessed, must be bold in aggression. Great applause, if it will do its duty to itself, if it will do its duty to the profession which it follows and to which it is devoted. The Bar can do everything else. It can have reformed constitutions. It can have a reformed judiciary. It can have the administration of justice made pure and honorable, and can restore both the judiciary and the Bar until it shall be once more, as it formerly was, an honorable and elevated calling. Applause continues. The senators who voted on the 6th of April, 1870, with but 2 dissenting voices, to hand New York City over to the depredation of Tweed and his Confederates were not to come again within reach of the people until the election of the 7th of November, 1871, when their successors were to be chosen. All hope of rescuing the city from their hands depended upon recovering the legislative power of the state by securing a majority of the Senate and Assembly. To this end, Mr. Tilden directed all his efforts. In a speech at the Cooper Union, he stated that the Tweed program was to control the senatorial representation from the city, and then re-elect 8, and, if possible, 12, of the Republican senators from the rural districts whom he had bought and paid for the previous year, and thus control all the legislation that might be attempted there, involving the fate of his freebooting dynasty. It was, said Mr. Tilden, because I had some misgivings that this might be done that I thought it my duty personally to take the field and help you in this conflict. The Ring felt and feared Tilden's influence. They tried to negotiate and compromise. They sought to alarm the country delegates and country politicians. They offered to surrender all part in the state convention and in the state organization. And severe pressure was brought on Mr. Tilden from powerful men all over the state to accept their proposals and save the party. Mr. Tilden's uniform reply was, "Who is to have the 5 senators and 21 assemblymen from New York?" For he felt that any success which did not include the capture of those positions was a defeat. He went to the state convention, and there, too, he made the same issue. He told them that the object of the Ring in getting a recognition of their organization by the state convention was that they might go back and nominate 21 assemblymen and 5 senators, and then say to the revolting Democrats of the metropolis, "If you don't vote this ticket, you are out of the Democratic Party." He denied that the system of organization then in use in the city had any moral right to be considered regular or to bind the Democratic masses, and proclaimed that he would not vote for one of its nominees as assemblymen or senators. To use his own language, a great many times that offer was repeated, and everything was tendered me except the Senate and Assembly of the state of New York. But I said that everything else was of no value for them to give, and of no value for me to take. Whatever else I might compromise, the legislation to affect the city government could not compromise, and I would not. Applause are loud. I told the state convention, being the nominal head of the Democratic Party of the state, for the sake of perfect frankness and distinctness, and in order that I might not be misunderstood, I told them that I felt it to be my duty to oppose any man who would not go for making the government of the city what it ought to be, at whatever cost, at whatever sacrifice. If they did not deem that regular, I would resign as chairman of the state committee and take my place in the ranks of my plundered fellow citizens and help them to fight their battle of emancipation. The war was thenceforth declared between the state organization and the Ring. It was a bold, some thought a reckless, step. The party organization in the city of New York, controlling a majority of from 40 to 50,000, and accepted by the state convention for years as the regular organization, had fallen completely into the possession of the Ring, and had been converted into a close corporation, within which no contests could be successfully waged against them so long as they retained their vast official power and patronage. The despondency and distrust of carrying the election in the city against the nominees of this organization, who would, of course, be in the interests of the Ring, was almost universal, for it is seldom that 10% of any party scratch the regular ticket. To the Democratic masses it was said, not only that the accused persons were innocent, but that even if guilty a great organization ought not to be destroyed for the wrong of a few individuals, that the party was not responsible for them, and that the particular nominees were good men. How were the votes of 20, 30, or 40,000 Democrats to be detached from this organization? Obviously nothing short of an organized revolt, under the best Democratic lead, and with no little good fortune, could accomplish so difficult a work against such extraordinary powers as were combined to uphold the existing system. A party in power is naturally disposed to risk the continuance of abuses rather than hazard the extreme remedy of cutting them out by the roots. The executive power of the state and all its recently enlarged official patronage were exerted against such a policy. Since the contest of 1869, the Ring had studied to extend its influence in the rural districts, and when their patronage gave out, showered legislative favors with the recklessness of desperation. Though without an office or a dollar's worth of patronage in city or state to confer, Mr. Tilden was not discouraged. He planted himself on the traditions of the elders and the moral forces of the community he was defending. That undaunted faith in the harmony of truth and its irreconcilability with error, which we have found sustaining him at the bar, sustained him here. Exactly how, through what agencies, by what instrumentalities, he did not know, but he was sustained by that kind of courage that casts out fear and feels no misgivings, as often happens to those who battle for the right. Providence came to his aid. The thieves fell out, and one of their number betrayed them. A clerk in the comptroller's office copied a series of entries afterwards known as secret accounts and handed them to the press for publication. They showed the dates and amounts of certain payments made by the comptroller, the enormous amounts of which, compared with the times and purposes of the payments and the recurrence of suspected names, awakened suspicions that they were the memorials of the grossest frauds. Mr. Tilden soon became satisfied of this, from the futility of the answers received from the city officers when questioned about them, and from other source, and reached the conclusion that the city had been the victim of frauds far transcending anything ever suspected. He immediately formed his plan, for the execution of which, as it involved the control of the approaching state convention, the cooperation of several leading Democrats was first secured. He accepted an arrangement by which he was to be sent to the convention from his native district, Columbia County, which had always during the Ring ascendancy afforded him that opportunity of being heard. Early in September he issued a letter to some 76,000 Democrats, reviewing the situation and calling upon them for their cooperation. Shortly before the meeting of the convention, an event happened which could not have been foreseen, but which was pregnant with the most important consequences. We will give Mr. Tilden's account of it as printed by him in a communication published in 1873. On the 14th of September Mr. Connolly, the comptroller, and one of Tweed's instruments applied to me, through a friend, for an interview. without knowing its object. I gave it on the morning of the 15th. The most artful members of the ring were plotting to save themselves to come in as parts of a new system, even as reformers, with added power upon Connolly's ruin. In his distrust of them, and fears for himself, he sought advice. I began by telling him that I could not be his counsel or assume any fiduciary relations toward him, that he and all the others must surrender all office and all local party leadership, and recognize the fact that their careers were ended. To this he assent, but still wanted my advice. I counseled him that he had no right to resign his office into the hands of his confederates, that such an act would be a new wrong against the public. To his inquiry whether if he remained he could get the money to carry on the government, I told him I would consult Mr. Seymour, and we would meet him again that evening. Mr. Seymour came, but Mr. Connolly did not. After consultation, Mr. Seymour went to Connolly's house, found him in bed sick, encouraged him, appointed a meeting at my house for the next morning at 10, and requested, as I had desired, that Connolly's counsel should come with him. Meantime I had examined the law and found a singular enactment, by which the comptroller was authorized to appoint a deputy, and confer upon him for a definite period all his own official powers. In the morning, when Mr. Seymour and Mr. Connolly and his counsel came, I pressed Mr. Connolly to surrender the office into the hands of the reformers by deputing Mr. Green to exercise all its powers, that he had less to fear from the public than from his confederates, that if he threw himself upon the mercy of the public and evinced a desire to aid the right, the storm would pass him and beat upon the others. His counsel said it was a personal question. One of them stated the opposite view taken by some of Mr. Connolly's friends. It was that, if he would resign, a man should be put in his place who would have character enough to assume the whole duty of investigation and would exclude the committee of which Mr. Booth was chairman, and that Mr. Connolly should be protected. It was disclosed that the counsel who presented this view had come fresh from an interview with Mr. Sweeney Tweed's chamberlain. At length Mr. Connolly consented. The papers were executed, Mr. Green sworn in, and they left my house only to go to the office of the comptroller and put Mr. Green in possession. The possession of the comptrollership by the reformers was a fatal embarrassment to the ring. It involved a publicity of all the expenditures of the departments, and was a restraint on those expenditures. It engendered doubt and dismay among them. It was an obstacle to such modes of raising money as had bought the charter in 1870, and to the hope of reimbursing advances for such purposes. It protected the records on which all civil and criminal actions must be founded, from such destruction as was attempted in the burning of the vouchers. Every investigation, including that of Mr. Booth's committee, were fruits of that possession. So also was the discovery of judicial proofs in the Broadway Bank, and the collection of such proofs which continued for 8 months afterwards, with important results, which have not even yet become public. It divided the influence of the city government in the elections, and struck a fatal blow at the prestige of the ring. Then began a struggle on the part of the ring to force Mr. Connolly to resign, in order that Mr. Green's powers might cease. On the 18th the mayor treated Mr. Connolly's deputation of Mr. Green as a resignation, and then, with singular inconsistency, assumed to have the authority to remove Mr. Connolly, though he had but recently insisted that he had no power of removal. The vacancy thus alleged to exist he, on 2 utterly incompatible theories and both totally unfounded, proceeded to fill. Early that morning, said Mr. Tilden, I sought Mr. O'Connor. My freedom from doubt about the law was no security. The moral support of his great legal name, affirming the validity of heir Green's possession, was necessary. He examined the statutes, and had no doubt. He consented to reduce his opinion to writing, saying that he would not take a fee, and inserting the explanation that the opinion was given at my request. It appeared in the Evening Post of that afternoon. An attempt, under color of judicial process, to forcibly eject Mr. Green was anticipated. A carriage was waiting to take me to Judge Brady. If a judge could be found to vacate fraudulent orders as fast as they could be granted, it was well. If not, I had resolved the next day to open an issue, in advance of the election of the new legislature, by proposing the call of a constitutional convention to revise the judiciary. Mr. O'Connor's opinion saved that day. Mr. O'Gorman, Tweed's corporation counsel, evading the legal question, advised the mayor, as a matter of expediency, to acquiesce in Mr. O'Connor's opinion, and the plot thus fell to pieces. But there were men behind the mayor who would not yet give up the struggle. When Keyser alleged that his name on the warrants was forged, the effort was renewed. It was in resisting it that I struck on the clue which led to the revelations of the Broadway Bank. The contest in the state convention quickly followed. It is but fair to admit that what I asked the convention to do was more than any party was ever found able to venture upon. It was to totally cut off and cast out from party association a local organization which held the influence growing out of the employment of 12,000 persons, and the disbursement of $30 million yearly, which had possession of all the machinery of local government, dominated the judiciary and police, and swayed the officers of the election. I still think that, on such an occasion, the greatest audacity in the right would have been the highest wisdom, and, in the long run, the most consummate prudence. If the convention could not reach that breadth and elevation of action, it nevertheless did help to break the prestige by which the organization expected to enthrall the local masses. For myself, I at no time hesitated to avow, as my conviction of duty and my rule of action, that 1 million of people were not to be given over to pillage to serve any party expediency, or to advance any views of state or national politics. For more than 3 months I devoted myself to this contest. Whatever seemed, on a general survey of the whole field, necessary to be done, I endeavored to find the best men and best methods to do. I addressed the democratic masses. I constantly pointed out to the public the legislative bodies as the turning point of the controversy. I entered into an arrangement with Mr. O'Connor and Mr. Evarts to go to the legislature, and when events afterwards induced them to abandon the intention, I went alone. I invited the meeting at which the reform delegation to the state convention originated, and helped to constitute that delegation. On the eve of the election, when Mr. Wickham, who was chairman of the newly extemporized Democratic Reform Organization, came to me to say that they could not supply booths or ballots without $10,000 beyond what they were able to raise, I agreed to provide it, and did so. With the aid of Mr. Edward Cooper, I raised from personal friends, including my own contributions, for the legitimate purposes of the contest, about the same sum which I understand the Committee of 70 collected from the whole community for similar purposes. The Broadway Bank investigations furnished the first, and for a long time the only, judicial proof of the frauds. They occupied me, and some 4 or 5 clerks and assistants, about 10 days. The analysis of the results and their application as proof were made by myself, as well as the original discovery of the relation of the numbers, which was the clue to all the revelation. The information thus obtained established the fact that but 1/3 of the nominal amount of the bills sanctioned by the Board of Audit had ever reached the persons who pretended to be entitled to the payments, and that 2/3 had been divided among public officers and their accomplices, into whose hands some of the dividends were actually traced. It converted a strong suspicion into a mathematical certainty, and it furnished judicial proof against the guilty parties. On this evidence, and on my affidavits verifying it, the action by the Attorney General was founded. It was found upon investigation that the legislation of the state had never contemplated, or at least had never adequately provided for, the punishment of the class of offenders who were then preying upon its commercial metropolis, and it was of the utmost importance that remedial legislation should be promptly secured. To this end it was arranged, as above stated, by Mr. Tilden that Charles O'Connor, William M. Evarts, and himself should all offer themselves as candidates for the legislature at the election in November 1871. Circumstances conspired to prevent the two former gentlemen from standing at that election, but Mr. Tilden stood and was elected. He gave his chief attention during the session to the promotion of those objects for which he consented to go there. The reform of the judiciary, and the impeachment of the judges who through Tweed and his confederates had acquired the control of the city. This course was in accordance not only with his own judgment, but with the advice of his experienced friend, ex-Governor Seymour, who wrote him the following letter only a few days before the legislature assembled. Seymour to Tilden, Utica, December 26, 1871. My dear sir, what are you going to do at Albany? Let us see how the land lies. You will be in a minority in the House. All of the hangers-on and more than one-half of the members hate you. They got their nominations with a view of making money. Everywhere throughout the state active men of both parties have been given an interest in some form in the ring plunder. Sinecures have been given to their friends and relations. They have had a share in jobs. In some direct or indirect way they gained by upholding frauds in New York. All clerks and agents have been cared for in supply bills. You can scarcely put your finger upon a clean spot in Albany. They will all laud your labor against the detected rogues, but they hate you, and will give you a fall if they can. They are skillful in tactics and in making up combinations. They can beat you in all these ways. Without going over the ground, I will give you the conclusions I have reached. When we meet I will state my reasons. In the first place, do not try to do too much. Do not take the place of leader of the Democratic Party, and take no more part in the business of legislation than duty demands. Do not take charge of the city charter. Vote upon its provisions as you think right. So much for what you must not do. There is but one way for you to serve the public. You must reform the judiciary. There are a dozen men who can beat you or me in a legislative fight on an ordinary question in the Assembly. When you come to a great and grave question of judicial reform, they are lost. They will give up to you upon such points, for they know but little and care less about them. The ring is now dead. Its friends are squirming yet, but they are mortally hurt. They can be left to die in due time. You have in New York worse men than Tweed. Men like Tweed, Fisk, and others, who have brought disgrace upon our country, could have done nothing without the help of the courts. To clean out the foul judiciary of your city is the only great work you can do this winter, and this you can do in a great way. It will excite the interest and attention not only of the state and nation, but of Europe as well. You will have the whole legal profession to uphold you in this work. The whole business interests of the country are deeply concerned in a purification of the judiciary of New York. It is a grand question, and it will lift you above the squabbles and intrigues of the legislature. No one will dare to oppose you. Get a good committee of investigation. If you find guilt, bring in articles of impeachment. Make this subject your specialty, and give as little attention to other matters as duty will permit. If you get the new charter in your hands, or if you get involved in the general legislation, you will fail. I shall be glad to meet you before the session begins. Truly yours, etc. Horatio Seymour. End of Chapter 8 Part 1.